Hello once again everyone, and I thought it was good time for me to do a video on Messer, which I've only mentioned a couple times, and I think I've done one video on it, but I wanted to give it a little bit of attention specifically because so many of the people at the school are either training Messer actively, or hopefully soon the new Landsknecht Emporium order will come in and a lot more people will get Messers. So I want to talk a little bit about some general advice when it comes to training Messer, as well as some explanation of some concepts, because Messer um, it's one of those arts that is not necessarily the way you would expect it to be upon first glance, but when are any of them? So first and foremost, let's talk about what type of Messer you might be using, and I have two of them here with me. Neither of them are Landsknecht Emporium ones, though you could look for the same traits. The first one I have here is my personal favorite, which would be my Albion Moxbruder. Now, this one is, I've had this for quite a while. I got it secondhand, and even then it had been used for several years, so that just speaks to its quality. As you'll notice, it has a bit more of a blade profile to it, so it's got the distinctive clip point, it's got a relatively wide blade, and a relatively heavy blade. This is definitely on the chunkier side of Messers, though it does not hit as hard as people seem to say. I mean, if you're swinging it uncontrolled, absolutely, but so will anything. The biggest thing I would say about this one is that it is more tippy, and depending upon what Messer you're using, it may be more or less tippy. So, for example, when I pull this guy around, its center of rotation is much further out in the blade than, for example, if I am utilizing this Arms and Armor, which is, at least when I was starting off, the more common Messer to find. That was before Landsknecht Emporium was really a thing. So, with this guy, blade's a little thinner, much less of an actual blade shape per se. I mean, it's still there, but it's not got the obvious clip point, etc. And the weight is much closer to the handle, so when I spin this around, it's right above my hand. It's got the more accurate wood slot grip, which does feel very comfortable in the bare hand. Feels very slippery if you're wearing heavies, so bear that in mind. I much prefer the cord grip for if I'm wearing any sort of heavier hand protection. But either way, all Messers are going to have the same couple pieces. They've got the long edge, the short edge, which is going to be about yay big. I have seen Messers where it goes down to about here. It can vary, but generally you want to accept about that much is going to be short edge. The spine, which is actively thickened on some Messers. The crosspiece, nothing too crazy there. The noggle, which is the big new addition, which I'll talk about again in a moment. And then, of course, a decently long grip. Some of them will have longer grips than others. Usually, you'll find you can put just about 2 hands on it, with most training Messers these days. Historical Messers, that varied. Sometimes you'd see them very short, sometimes you see them very short overall, and sometimes they would also have a knuckle bow. But, either way, let's start talking about general use of the Messer and some useful things to bear in mind. So first and foremost, you want to be letting the sword do the work for you. If you look at any of the Messer treatises, you're going to notice a very upright posture for a lot of these actions. You also notice the hand position will tend to be behind the back or across the chest. I, out of habit from doing a lot of backsword, keep my hand kind of on the hip all the time now. But either way, you're going to notice that rather than being kind of sunken low as you might expect, they are much more erect. Most of the postures even have slight hip turnings, as you would expect to see in Bolognese or other sort of more later period arts where they start putting a bit more emphasis on those hips. Messer has that as well. And an important thing to remember is that this erect posture is not just for aesthetic reasons. It has a purpose to it, which I'll get back to in a moment. So let's talk about a little bit of how to form the posture, depending upon what you're doing, and how to avoid moving out of it. So, first and foremost, what you want to do is you want to make sure that your left foot is going to predominantly be in front. Now, this will change, but in general, for most actions, you want your left foot to be in front, so that way your sword can come from your dominant side with your right foot adding to the step. Either as 1, as 2, or without, and then using the right step for its follow-up action. So, you'll see some variation there depending upon what you're looking for. But either way, left foot is forward, toe is pointed. I'm not necessarily standing up straight, but I am much more upright than I normally would be. Usually when I'm fencing, I'll sink it down a little bit more, but I'm not in my normal sort of longsword posture. I'm going to be a little more upright, and my weight is, nice and balanced, about 50-50. Now, you have various guards that you can take. At the moment, I'm holding Lugisland, which is Watchtower, is what it translates to. It's basically Vamtag. You'll also see Stier, Eber, and Bastei. Stier being steer, ox, Eber being boar, as per its tusk, and Bastei being bastion. Now, these are relatively easy to remember, in my opinion, because you've got fortification, fortification, animal, animal. Always found that kind of nice inverses of each other. But either way, these positions can be taken on both sides without much difficulty. Some other positions that you'll take pretty commonly that they don't really talk about is having the point just down and low, either open or forward. Now this is still Bastei, but you will sometimes see it held out here. You can take the Schrankut, you can do a bunch of different things just out. It will describe having the tip down by your knee. Other times it will say to place it onto the shoulder, which could be the flat against my shoulder, it could be the spine literally resting against my shoulder, doesn't particularly matter. And then of course you will see, it's never actually called Nebenhut as far as I'm aware, at least not officially, but this lower first position is generally a good one. It's either off of the draw, or alternatively you're taking it, so that way you can do actions while you step away. Very common position to take. Either way though, these are going to be your kind of main ones, and we're going to flow through them a couple times to go over the general footwork as well as general cutting. But before we get into that, let's talk about grip. So, one of the biggest things that is going to come up when you do messer fighting, and I was super guilty of it, and you can even see it there on the messer, you notice that dark spot on the blade, is the thumb grip. Especially with the messer, given how some of its actions involve the thumb, just like longsword, I find that a lot of people stay in the thumb grip nearly all the time, and I also did this, but an important thing to remember is that the thumb grip is an option, not a requirement. And if you keep your thumb on the blade, absolutely you can do some interesting things with it, but the longer you keep it there, the more you're going to wear out your arm quickly. You want to let the sword do the work, and when you're using the thumb grip, your arm starts doing the work. Not that you can't let the sword do some of the work, but it is a transition that you go into. And not to mention there are some actions where, for example, we'll bind, then I'll stick the thumb up onto the blade to add a little bit of leverage, versus my thumb's already on there, I get what I get. I don't get that option to transition. So bear that in mind. So, in which case, how do you grip the messer? Well, you want to treat it a bit like a wrestling grip. If you've never done any sort of judo or ringen or anything like that, the way you want to grip is not with these. You want to grab with the pinky and the ring finger and the index and curl that in to your hand. So that way these are relatively loose. They're there, but they're relatively loose. It's mostly this that is sinking the grip in. Same idea here. I'm going to roll my fingers in, gripping. My hand is on top of the sword, as we've talked about before. And then my index and thumb are relatively light at the moment. Now what this lends to is it lends to cutting a lot less like boom, and a little bit more I'm squeezing, and the blade is going out away from me. And that is a very important thing to get used to, because you can start relaxing your fingers or contracting your fingers to add that snap into it. So for example, a cut can look like this, where I let just my arm fall and I step forward, or a cut can look like that, where I squeeze and it tends to go out a little bit more. It can vary. But either way, just remember that these grips are options and things that you should be able to flow kind of in and out of. But a general rule of thumb, pun unintended, is if your arm is hurting from just a little bit of practice, it's not that you're weak. You're probably straining some muscles that are doing more work than they need to. With most of these positions, especially Lugisland, a lot of people look at Lugisland and they think it's kind of ridiculous, but what I'm doing here when I cut is I'm not forcing my arm down. I'm basically just pointing the sword and letting it fall. This has more than enough meat to do its job. Same thing with any of my cuts. If I cut from below, same idea once again. I am not forcing it up. I'm just kind of starting the point moving and then reinforcing it with my body, whatever side I'm doing that on. But either way. So now we've got all these pieces. Let's talk about some basic flow, right? Now, of course, the mire cutting pattern is a wonderful thing for us to use, so we'll use it once again. You're going to start up in Lugisland. Make sure you're nice and erect. You can have your hand on your stomach, on your breast, on your hips, behind your back. I don't really care. It doesn't really matter. But either way, from here, we're going to start off with a nice simple, I almost said one cut, but an Oberhau coming from our right. So we're going to just let the sword do the work, pass forward, and I don't turn myself too much, but I do go ahead and reach decently far with my cut, and I just pass forward, and I end up basically in best eye. I'm going to now turn over, and I'm going to step up once again. Boom! I'm now ending up basically in Stier. And I recommend that after you cut, you go ahead and you can withdraw to guard to get familiar with these positions, as Stier is not held out, it's here. So my arm is withdrawn, because it's very easy to take risks in this. But I'm now into Stier. For my next cut, you can do it in two ways. You can either bring it down, then up through, then into Stier, or you can instead relax, squeeze, and make it a shorter cut. I recommend practicing both because they're both particularly useful to do. But either way, we're now here into Stier on the other side. From here, we're going to just turn our arm over and once again let the sword do the work. Now that one in particular is a little bit easier to muscle because it's a backhand cut, which means it has a lot more power to it. But I recommend just squeezing and getting used to letting your fingers do the work and just following it with your body. So, let's do that all again. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we're just back to Lugisland. Nothing too complicated. Now another thing I recommend you get used to doing is doing all of the mire cutting patterns. So in case you don't know, I do have videos up on it, but after you finish the first one, which is down, up, down, you'll go up, down, down, up. The last one, where you finish up here, requires me to cut from this side. Now with longsword, that's a little tricky, because we've been passing every time. But the way you do it, with two hands or one hand, is you just bring it around your head and cut with your hips in the same place. This is a very important motion to learn how to do with Messer, as there will be often times when we act out here and then don't move our feet, but go around someone's blade or what have you. There will even be times when we are actively stepping in the same direction as our cuts to avoid things. So, this is if you can get into that later pattern, getting used to doing this cut is particularly useful. You can even start chambering your hip into it a little bit. You could set yourself in such so that when you come, you can bring the hip over, front hip, back hip, kind of doesn't matter. It's just whatever feels good to you. Now, that's all relatively simplistic. Just do the mire cutting pattern, but get used to doing it with, again, the sword doing the work and these more extended sort of cuts. What else do we need to learn? Well, the other thing we really need to learn is a couple extra bits of footwork, as well as you need to quickly become familiar with the bogan. So, the bogan is one of those that you can also do against the air, which is quite nice. I have talked about the bogan before in the blocks and parries vid that I did during quarantine, but I will go over it again. So, bogans are generally best done from a low position, be it here, here, or here. You can even do them from out here. Doesn't particularly matter. But the idea here is going to be, as a cut comes down, I am going to flee it or step into it. Now, if you watched the video on voiding an Italian rapier, I said in general you want to move away from cuts. That is true. But because most of these cuts are coming down a little bit more sheerly, as well as they are not quite as powerful as a two-hand cut, we can sometimes get away going into them. That will lead into a grappling action most times, but it's pretty comfortable with the Messer. So either way. Now the bogan can be done with a couple different styles of footwork. So if the cut is coming down from my left, I'm going to step out with my back foot for my first one. So what's going to happen here is I am going to draw my arm out to the side and step with my right foot forward and obliquely. Now the important thing here is that I am not reaching up to block the cut coming in. If you try to do that, you'll often get tagged in the fingers. The idea is I'm moving my head, moving my body, and moving my arm at the same time, so that what he does hit is already just blade, but it's blade down to here rather than to here, right? We're not looking to stop their action. We're looking to meet it and then roll off of it. So, imagine there's a string tied to your wrist and to your ankle. You're just going to out to defend yourself, and then from here, the action is relatively simplistic. I can just bring my left foot around in a compass step and execute my cut. You can also utilize this to grab. If you're stepping more to the side, generally you're going to be pushing as opposed to entrapping, but keeping your arm up here can prevent them from stopping you cutting, things along those lines. So that's relatively simple, and it works the exact same on the other side. So I stepped with my back leg. If I'm on this side and the cut is coming down, be it from my left or even from my right, doesn't really matter. I'm going to step out with this leg and I push my hand even further. This one in particular is the one that people, when they're first learning it, get hit on a lot and also rely on too much. I was fortunate enough that I had to fight a lot of left-handers, so I got very familiar with this very quickly. Some general advice on this guy. Don't let your arm curl. You're not doing this guy. It's not a telephone block. This won't really protect you at all, because what will happen is that blade will wrap over your sword and hit you. If they're going more for your shoulder, it might protect you, but as you fold out of it, it's going to slice you. Instead, what I want to do is, as I go to move into this, I'm going to punch my arm out in front of me, and I'm going to let my fingers relax significantly. It's going to hit about there, and then it's going to slide off, and at that same time, again, I just bring myself around. So, same exact idea. There's a string tied to my ankle and to my wrist. Punch out. You can push the arm up here. It's a little more awkward if you're right-handed because I got to reach a bit further. But if you can get hold of someone's elbow, which is quite nice, and then through. Generally, I'll use this action if I'm looking to do what is called a pommel hook. So I'd be stepping a little more forward into them. I bring my hand up to grab. I hook over their wrist with the palm at the same time. Then you just pull back like a seatbelt. So it's not necessarily required to be a closing action, but generally one that goes a little bit more inward. Either way. So that's the wide ones. Let's talk about your other options. The other option is I'm going to use my front foot. So for this, we're going to do what's called a cross-line pass. So here I am, the cut comes down, I am going to step across while at the same time making my cover. So once again, my wrist and my ankle are tied together, so that way it moves out of the way. Now, as you can see, this is not a position I'm going to stand in. Can I? Yes, I can settle myself into this, but I'm not going to want to. The idea of doing a cross-line pass is that I'm going to be able to then bring much more of my leg around with my follow-up cut. Some people I find also just prefer doing this one, either because, maybe their weight's a little more on their back leg, so it's easier for them to move their front leg, or various reasons, right? Everyone's going to have their little preferences here and there. I recommend you train so you can do both fluidly. Hell, you should even be able to switch them on the fly. But either way. So, in comes the cut. Cross-line pass. You notice my toe is facing inward as I do this. It is recommended, because if my toe faces out, now my hips are facing away, and it's going to be a much weirder step for me to come around and hit that central target. So instead, I want to make sure my hips are staying open to target, so when I step around, I can cut without difficulty. I do not recommend that you try to close with a cross-line step. Can you do it? Yes. The problem is, if they pull, you may be able to follow them, but I find a lot of people accidentally kick their own leg. So, in general, if you're looking to close, use the back leg. But, either way. This can also be done on the other side without much difficulty. So now my right leg is in front. I'm going to, once again, step up and through, and then over with hit. This one I don't mind closing with, because what I'm doing at this point is I'm catching, hooking, now I step much more up because I have that point of contact to pull myself into the action, versus before I was having to pull out from this side and step around my own leg, which is always a little awkward. But either way, so now we've got two different styles of footwork, right? We've got boom, cut, then we've got boom, cut, right? So a 1-2 or a 1-2-3. But there is another, which is if I wish to cross-line step with my back foot. This one, it doesn't come up a ton, but it does occasionally come up, so I will cover it. The idea here is that if the cut is coming in, I'm going to use the cover from this side, but I'm going to bring my back foot up and through to help me. So, as the cut comes down, I step up and through, I catch, and now I have the advantage of being able to do a 1, 2, 3 once again, or alternatively the other way. Boom, 1, 2, 3, right? So, all these are great options, and you should practice them equally. The important thing to remember is that it's not the sword coming up to block, it's you moving out of the way, and the sword is now covering where you were and where you are. Now, a good way to practice this is, of course, to have another person with you, and you just trade bogans back and forth, but you can also practice it against the air quite easily. So, start off in Lugisland, cut down. Okay, I'm right leg forward, which means I can either cross, or oblique. So from here, I'm going to oblique, cut down. Okay, now I'm here, cross, cut down, cross, cut down, right? Oblique, cut down. And you can just alter things as you go. If you can find a way to have a central target, like right now I'm aiming at the camera, but something to target at, because after you finish your cover, you always want to be extending through the target, because that's what's going to allow you to line back up, and you end up in a good best die. But, so we talked a lot about cuts. Let's talk a little bit about thrusts, because this is really where Messer starts to get interesting. Because even though you might think, ooh, big, hacky, cutty weapon, the majority of techniques are either strong cuts that go to a bind and then work from there, or alternatively, thrusts and winding. In fact, generally, Messer, I joke that it's, 60% swordsmanship, 40% wrestling, but really it's more like 60% point work and then 40% big actions is a better description. Wrestling and then the cutting kind of being the same because of the tempo they require. So, generally when it comes to thrusts, they're going to be pretty simplistic. Most of the time you're going to cut out, meet into a bind, and from there you need to manipulate the bind in a couple different ways. Now, this is where the noggle comes back in, as well as two pieces of the sword that most people don't think about a whole lot, and those are your flats. So, important difference. When swords touch edge on edge, they can stick. They don't always stick, but generally there's going to be that resistance, and you get a lot more control. It's literally like having your hand on the blade for just a moment. When the edge is on the flat, it slides the same as these do. In fact, more so than the blunt edges of these do, because it just slips right by. That's an important thing to consider, because if I wish to deny someone a bind or change the way it's working, so if we're edge on edge right now, I pop the flat up, he will slide and lose a lot of presence. Now normally, that wouldn't be a good thing, but we have the noggle there to protect us, which means that oftentimes you're going to find your actions ending up with the noggle turned outward in both directions. And you notice now that my thumb is moving up to reinforce. This is because this is good use of the thumb grip. When I am here, I can just turn my arm up, but if I add that thumb into it, now I'm starting to almost end like a Schielhau. And what's nice about that is now, when he slides in, I've got much more of a shock absorber. I'm a lot stronger in regards to pushing this out. And if he tries to push my tip out of the way, I can turn through with it or do whatever I really want to do, right? There's a bunch of different actions from there. This is where you kind of start to get new forms of Stier and Ebe. So, we got Stier, we got Ebe. We can also have basically Langenort, right? Just high and low, but they are still Stier and Ebe. And then you can also have thumb or thumb on both sides, right? Where it kind of curls more in and is more easy to transition with my guard going either way. This is particularly nice if you like Duplieren or Mutieren. But, either way, thumbs can also be used in cutting. As a note, I can snap around with the short edge, I can come down with the long edge, I can do a bunch of different things. But generally, the thumb is going to be employed as a game changer. So we'll come into a bind, I'll put my thumb up through here. When he moves that tip, since my thumb is already on the blade, I'll bring it through and cut, versus if my thumb is not on the blade, or alternatively I change that my mind, I just cut with the long edge. And that mix-up is going to be very important because you'll find people who get stuck in Zwerkow mode. You'll find them in everything. But the Zwerk with this, the Entrostal, is particularly short, so beware, because people can take your arms without much concern. So, but anyway, back to thrusts. Generally, you're going to be thrusting long edge against them, though there will be times when you turn the flat, like I said. Another important thing to consider is always where your noggle is going to be, as sometimes you do one on the outside, but sometimes you can get a bit more by having your long edge stand upward. And especially if you're studying the work of the priest Lekukner, he will mention which edge should be upward, and you should adhere to that as much as you can, because an action where you do this, it may still work, but he's meaning for you to be here, and the slight difference in reach and what you can then move into will affect things. Now, the other thing that we need to talk about is the spine. Now, the spine is one of those weird ones, because most of the time when we attack with the short edge, we're hitting with the very, very tip. So I come around with the schnappen, I'm hitting, if I hit that light right there, right? I'm hitting with the very, very tip, so my distance is still quite big, right? Versus I come around with the schnappen and I hit with the spine, I'm much closer. There are specifically instances where we will hit with the spine. There are even instances where we'll hit with the flat, because another important thing to consider is the context of a lot of these Messer actions. And that kind of brings me to my kind of main final point, which is Messer is a mixed bag, to say the least, of sources and intent. Most Messer sources you're going to find, Talhofer, Paulus Call, Faulkner is relatively large, but either way, these snippets tend to be relatively small. You don't find huge, expensive works like Lekukner. You would expect that more people would write, a full Bible of stuff like Lekukner did, but for the most part, Messer actions tend to boil down into a handful of good techniques. In regards to Paulus Call and Talhofer, I can personally attest that all of those work. I did them in tournament. But either way, you're not going to find very large sources for the most part. You will, however, and within those sources, you're going to find what I refer to as carny fencing, right? Now, that's not to say these are bad, but at fairs and festivals, people would fence for glory. Right? This is a common thing. Heck, we're still doing it today if you think about it. But either way, there's an understanding that you're not going to try and kill the other person. And so there are techniques that are designed to shame the opponent, or to lock up the opponent, or to disarm them. If you've seen my video on Lignitzer, the instance where we rip away the buckler, that's a disarm. He now has lost. I've taken one of his weapons. There's references to putting the point through both cheeks. I guess that was okay. But like I said, there will be instances where you strike them pleasantly, so they feel it well, with the flat, or with the spine, or places like that, where it won't necessarily kill the person. There are cuts given to the face relatively lightly. There are a lot of lockups, or things along those lines. There's even a couple instances where you hold a person down by locking them and then holding them in either a pin, or there's one where you have the sword basically entangled in their arms like so. So that is an important thing to consider, is that you're going to find techniques where it's like, this doesn't seem martial, right? It is still. It's a demonstration of martial skill within a friendly context. And if you've seen some of the sword takings that I've been talking about in the Wallerstein series, you'll know a little bit more about that. But just be aware. That doesn't mean they're bad techniques. Just consider when you want to use them. Use them when things are definitely more in your corner. But all that is to say, that's a little bit of a basic introduction to Messer. One more drill for you, just because we didn't do it with thrusts. Of course, you want to be practicing thrusting to the 4 peaks, which are the 4 peaks are your 4 openings, so above belt, below belt, below belt. You can do it just by going from steer, over, steer, ebe, steer, and just back and forth like that, and making sure that when you thrust, you're turning the edge all the way over, etc. But either way, nice simple drill. I talk about it a little bit more in my sword in one hand video, if you'd like to go watch that. But either way, those are just some simple bits of advice from a longtime Messer fencer. I hope they are helpful, and like I said, if your arm is hurting, you're probably asking too much of your arm, right? Let the sword do the work, and above all, don't try to spar too hard with Messer, because it's going to be a while before things really click, and especially if you are fencing someone who either doesn't train Messer or is fighting Messer of a different system. So, for example, someone who has never done Messer but has done other one-handed swords or even other two-handed swords, it's not going to look like the actions in the book. I'm telling you that right now. But that's why those smaller sections that I talked about, like Paulus Call and Talhofer, that's why they work so well, is because they deal with that, versus Lekukner tends to deal with someone who kind of knows what they're doing. But either way, I recommend that when you work with it a lot in gear, but don't always, when you spar, try to go hard, try to go tourney style. Take some time, in fact, take a lot of time, to just play with the Messer, to figure out your tricks, to get used to your closing actions, etc., to get a feel for when you need to shift into the Nach, for when you need to step up and take that Vor, for the explosiveness of your actions, etc. Because really, Messer is a great training tool for general fencing in the German style. It's a great training tool for fencing in general. And if it's wearing you out, you're probably working a little too hard at it. It's one of those that it should, make you more physically strong, absolutely. And you do need to be fit to do it, but it shouldn't be killing your arm. Because, trust me, been there, done that. Once I changed my approach, my arm doesn't hurt anymore. So, bear that in mind. But either way, thank you very much for watching, and we will go over some other techniques another time.